February 1st, 1943. The sky over Tunisia was crystalline blue, the kind of blue that made death seem impossible. Second Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg held his Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress steady in formation, the controls responding with the familiar resistance of 4 Wright Cyclone engines pulling 70,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, bombs and men through air so thin that every breath required an oxygen mask. All American, that's what they'd named her. The words painted in white near the nose, alongside 7 small bomb symbols. This would be number 8. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Through the plexiglass ahead, Bragg could see the other bombers of the 97th Bomb Group stretched across the sky, each maintaining its precise position in the defensive box formation. Behind him, the German-controlled ports of Bizerte and Tunis were already fading into smoke and haze. The mission was complete. 6,000 pounds of high explosives had fallen onto the docks that fed Rommel's army, and now all that remained was the 300-mile flight back to Biskra airfield in Algeria, 300 miles over enemy territory where German fighters hunted American bombers like wolves, culling a herd. The intercom crackled. Tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpelis, called out from his lonely position in the tail. All clear behind, no fighters visible, but fighters were coming. They always did. What none of the crew aboard All American could have known, what no amount of training or briefing could have prepared them for, was that in the next 60 seconds their aircraft would collide with a Messerschmitt Bf 109 at 250 miles per hour. That 3/4 of their tail section would be severed, hanging by fragments of aluminum skin and a handful of control cables, and that they would then fly that impossible configuration for 90 minutes back to base, landing with every crew member uninjured in what would become one of the most photographed and mythologized moments of World War II. The Germans believed it was impossible. American engineers would later calculate it was impossible. But physics and belief mean nothing when 10 men decide that impossible simply means they haven't figured out how yet. To understand how All American became legend, we need to go back to August 1942, 6 months before that collision, when a factory-fresh B-17F rolled off Boeing's production line in Seattle and began a journey that would take it from the industrial heart of America to the burning skies over North Africa. The B-17F represented Boeing's third major revision of the Flying Fortress concept, longer range than earlier models, more defensive armament, stronger airframe. But these improvements came at a cost. The aircraft weighed 65,000 pounds, empty, fully loaded, with crew, fuel, ammunition and bombs. It topped 70,000 pounds. All of that weight was kept aloft by 4 1,800 horsepower radial engines and wings spanning 103 feet, covered in aluminum skin so thin you could dent it with your fist. Thin skin meant less weight, which meant more bombs, or more fuel, or more range. It also meant that a 20mm cannon shell would pass through the fuselage like a needle through tissue paper. The B-17 was never designed to take battle damage. It was designed to avoid battle damage through defensive firepower and formation flying. When that failed, crews learned quickly that their fortress was more metaphor than reality. All American arrived at the 97th Bomb Group on August 24th, 1942. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, a 24-year-old pilot from North Carolina, was assigned as aircraft commander. His crew chose the name All American, simple, patriotic, the kind of name that appeared on 1,000 other bombers across a dozen air bases. But names only become meaningful when tested. The 97th had been the first American heavy bomber group to arrive in England earlier that August, flying the first 8th Air Force mission against occupied France on August 17th. Small raids, minimal losses, early confidence that American daylight precision bombing would succeed. But by November 1942, the strategic situation had changed. Operation Torch had landed Allied forces in Morocco and Algeria, and the 97th was transferred from England to North Africa. To support the campaign against German and Italian forces in Tunisia, all American flew to Maison Blanche in Algeria on November 13th, then to Tafaraoui, then finally to Biskra on Christmas Day, 1942. Biskra, a dusty airfield on the northern edge of the Sahara, 300 miles from the enemy-held ports along the Tunisian coast, close enough to strike German supply lines, far enough to require flying over hostile territory both ways, through fighter zones and flak batteries that grew more formidable with each passing week. The crews called it the Milk Run when losses were light. They called it Black Tuesday or Bloody Thursday when they weren't. February 1st would simply be called Monday, which somehow made it worse. Death didn't need drama, it just needed opportunity. Bragg's crew had flown 7 combat missions by February 1st. They understood the mathematics of survival. Every mission reduced your odds. Some crews completed 25 missions and went home. Most didn't. The replacement crews arriving from the States looked younger every week, and the veterans stopped learning their names until they'd survived 5 missions. 5 missions meant you might make it to 10. 10 meant you might make it home. But 7 missions meant you were still in the danger zone. Still learning. Still making mistakes that got people killed. The mission profile for February 1st was standard. 14 B-17s from the 414th Bombardment Squadron would form up with other squadrons of the 97th Group and fly northeast to Tunisia, targeting the ports that supplied German General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army. The Germans were building up forces in Tunisia faster than the Allies could interdict them. Ships from Sicily, just 120 miles across the Mediterranean, were delivering thousands of tons of supplies weekly. Bombing the ports wouldn't stop the flow, but it would slow it enough, and maybe the Allied ground forces pushing from Algeria could reach Tunis before the Germans could fortify. Maybe. Bragg's co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, called Bill by the crew. Navigator Harry Newsell plotted courses with the precision of a mathematician because navigation errors over North Africa meant death from fuel exhaustion, or German fighters, or simply getting lost over terrain that looked identical in every direction. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge would guide the bombs onto target using the Norden bomb sight, that supposedly miraculous device that American propaganda claimed could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. In reality, hitting a specific building was considered good, hitting the general target area was acceptable, missing entirely and bombing empty desert or, worse, Allied positions happened more often than anyone admitted. The defensive crew included flight engineer and top turret gunner, Technical Sergeant Joe James, radio operator Paul Galloway, ball turret gunner Elton Conder, waist gunner Michael Zuck, and tail gunner Sam Sarpelis. 10 men total, each essential, each vulnerable. They took off from Biskra at 0700 hours. The formation assembled over the airfield, climbing through haze into clear sky, then turned northeast toward Tunisia. At altitude, the temperature dropped to 30 below 0 Fahrenheit. Ice formed on oxygen masks. Gun turrets froze until gunners kicked them free. The cold seeped through flight suits and gloves and boots until fingers went numb and toes lost feeling, and the only warmth came from the knowledge that freezing to death at altitude was slower than what happened when German fighters arrived. The fighter escort, such as it existed, could only accompany them to the coast. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts lacked the range to penetrate deep into Tunisia and return. Once the escorts peeled away, the bombers were alone in hostile sky with nothing but their own guns and the geometry of their formation to protect them. Flak appeared first, black flowers blooming in the air around the formation, each burst the size of a house, each one capable of shredding aluminum like paper. The German 88mm anti-aircraft batteries around Bizerte and Tunis had been firing at Allied aircraft for months. The gunners knew the altitudes, knew the approach vectors, knew exactly where American bombers would be. They filled those boxes of sky with steel fragments, traveling at speeds that made evasion pointless. The bombers flew through it because turning away meant missing the target, and missing the target meant coming back tomorrow to face the same guns again. You endured flak. You didn't avoid it. You listened to the sounds of shrapnel hitting your aircraft and hoped that nothing vital was struck, that no fuel tanks were punctured, that no engines were lost, that the random mathematics of explosive fragmentation wouldn't intersect with the precise location of your body. All Americans shuddered as a near burst peppered the fuselage. Small holes appeared in the aluminum skin. Nothing critical, as the formation pressed on. Then came the release. The bombs fell away, the aircraft lifting slightly as 3 tons left the bomb bay. Below, the Tunis docks erupted in smoke and fire. Direct hits, near hits, close enough to matter. The bombardier confirmed bombs away, and the formation began its turn back toward Algeria. That's when the Messerschmitts arrived. 2 Bf-109s dove from altitude, dark shapes against blue sky, their cannons hammering. 20mm and 30mm shells walking across the formation. The lead bomber took hits, smoke trailing from a damaged engine. All Americans' gunners opened fire, 50 caliber tracers arcing out to meet the attackers. The sound was deafening even through the noise of engines and slipstream. Spent brass casings clattered across the deck. Feldwebel Erich Paxier lined up his approach on All-American. Paxier was an experienced pilot with I Jagdgeschwader 53, operating from airfields in Tunisia. He had been hunting American bombers for months and knew their vulnerabilities. The head-on attack, that's what German fighter pilots had learned to exploit. Come straight at the bomber from 12 o'clock high, closing speed over 500 miles per hour, engagement window less than 2 seconds. Walk your cannon fire through the nose, the cockpit, the forward fuselage. Kill the pilots and the bomber becomes a flying coffin. Paxier pressed his attack. His guns blazed. All Americans' defensive fire responded. Shells crossed in the air between them, death traveling in both directions at speeds that defied human reaction time. Then something went wrong. Whether Paxier was hit by defensive fire, whether he was killed outright or wounded, whether his controls were damaged, no one would ever know with certainty. What witnesses saw was the Bf-109 failing to break off its attack run. The fighter kept coming, wings level, heading straight for All-American as if guided by some mechanical inevitability. Bragg saw it. Through the plexiglass, he watched the fighter growing larger, its approach angle wrong, too steep, not maneuvering. He shoved the control yoke forward, trying to dive beneath the fighter's path, but 70,000 pounds of bomber doesn't respond instantly to control inputs. Physics governs momentum, and momentum takes time to change direction. The Messerschmitt's right wing struck All-American just aft of the bomb bay. The fighter was traveling approximately 250 miles per hour. The bomber was traveling approximately 200 miles per hour. The closing speed meant the impact occurred with the force of a small bomb detonating inside the B-17's fuselage. Metal screamed. The fighter disintegrated, its wing shearing off, its fuselage tumbling through the sky, pieces of German aircraft embedding themselves in American aluminum. Erich Paxier, if he was still conscious, had perhaps 2 seconds to comprehend what was happening before his fighter impacted the Tunisian desert 30,000 feet below. He didn't survive, but the damage to All-American was catastrophic in ways that seemed incompatible with continued flight. The Messerschmitt's wing had sliced diagonally through the B-17's rear fuselage, cutting through 3/4 of the aircraft's width. The left horizontal stabilizer, that crucial surface that kept the tail level, was completely torn away. The fuselage was severed except for a few stringers and a narrow strip of aluminum skin on the right side. Control cables were cut, hydraulic lines were severed, electrical systems were damaged. Oxygen lines to the rear of the aircraft were destroyed. From his position in the ball turret beneath the fuselage, Elton Conda watched the Messerschmitt debris fall away and saw something that made his breath catch. The tail section was swinging, not vibrating, swinging, moving independently of the rest of the aircraft as if it was connected by a hinge instead of solid structure. In the tail, Sam Sarpelas felt the impact like a sledgehammer, hitting the entire aircraft. His position lurched violently. The floor beneath him disappeared into rushing air and twisted metal. He grabbed his guns to steady himself and realized with a clarity that cut through fear that he was now isolated in a section of aircraft that was barely attached to the rest of the bomber. The only thing connecting him to his crew was the intercom line that miraculously still functioned, carrying his voice forward through wires that had somehow survived the destruction. He keyed his microphone. "We've been hit. Tail section is damaged. I'm still here, but I can't move forward. There's no floor." In the cockpit, Bragg was fighting forces that wanted to flip the aircraft inverted. The control yoke had been wrenched from his hands at impact. Warning lights painted the instrument panel red and amber, oil pressure dropping on the right engines, hydraulic pressure gone, electrical systems fluctuating, and worst of all, the aircraft was yawing hard to the left, trying to spin, the damaged tail creating asymmetric drag that no amount of rudder correction could fully counter. Co-pilot Bill Engel grabbed his yoke and both pilots pulled, fighting to level the wings to regain some semblance of control over an aircraft that had just suffered damage that should have resulted in immediate structural failure and catastrophic crash. But All-American was still flying, somehow, impossibly, against every principle of aerodynamics and structural engineering. Flight engineer Joe James climbed down from his turret and made his way aft to assess the damage. What he saw defied comprehension. The fuselage had a gash 16 feet long and 4 feet wide at its widest point. He could see the sky through the top of the fuselage. The tail section beyond the gash was swinging in the slipstream, moving up to 18 inches out of alignment with each oscillation, held in place by nothing more than a few bent structural members and a strip of skin that looked ready to tear at any moment. Sarpalus was visible through the gap, standing in his gun position, because there was nowhere else to stand. The floor between him and the rest of the crew was gone, replaced by rushing air and a 30,000-foot drop to the Tunisian desert. James keyed the intercom. "Skipper, we've got massive structural damage aft of the Bombay. Tail section is barely attached. Sarpalus is trapped back there. No way to reach him unless the tail tears off completely." Bragg processed this information with the mechanical calm of someone who understands that panic serves no purpose. "Can we maintain flight?" "We're flying now," James replied. "I don't know how, but we are." Navigator Harry Nuessel had already calculated their position, approximately 270 miles from Biskra, at their current indicated airspeed, about 90 minutes flying time, 90 minutes during which the tail could separate, 90 minutes during which German fighters could finish what the collision had started, 90 minutes during which any number of secondary failures could occur from damage they couldn't see. The other bombers in the formation had watched the collision. They had seen pieces of the Messerschmitt fall away. They had seen All-American lurch and drop out of formation, trailing debris, and now they were making their own calculations. Stay with the damaged bomber and risk being left behind where German fighters could attack the entire group, or maintain course and speed and trust that All-American would either keep up or fall behind on its own. The formation began to fragment. Some bombers slowed, maintaining position on All-American to provide defensive fire if fighters attacked. Others pressed ahead, crews making the brutal calculation that survival sometimes meant leaving the wounded behind. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge called over the intercom. "2 more 109s, 11 o'clock high, coming in." The German fighters had seen the damaged bomber, saw it falling behind the formation, saw the perfect target, damaged, slow, possibly with wounded crew and damaged guns. This was the easy kill that fighter pilots dreamed about, the kind of victory that required minimum risk and provided maximum confirmation. But All-American's guns still worked. When the Messerschmitts dove in for their attack run, they were met with streams of 50 caliber fire from positions all around the bomber. The top turret hammered away, the ball turret tracked and fired. The waist gunner, Michael Zook, stood with his head and shoulders protruding through the torn fuselage where the roof should have been, aiming his gun manually because the standard mounting points no longer existed. He was exposed to the slipstream, to the cold, to enemy fire. But he could aim and he could shoot, and that meant he was contributing to their survival. In the tail, Sam Sarpelis had his own problem. The entire tail section swung and twisted with each movement of the aircraft. When he fired his guns, the recoil caused the tail to yaw, actually turning the bomber. He learned to fire in short bursts, compensating with his own body weight for forces that should have been managed by tons of structural aluminum. The Messerschmitts broke off their attack. Too much defensive fire, too much risk. The damaged American was still dangerous, and there would be easier targets another day. They peeled away and disappeared into the haze, leaving all American alone in empty sky with her improbable collection of damage and her even more improbable continued flight. Bragg made a decision. All crew, this is pilot. We're going to try to make it back to Biskra. Prepare for possible bailout, but we're not giving up on her yet. Engineer, get everyone into parachutes. Sarpelis, you stay in position. Your weight might be helping stabilize the tail. Understood, Skipper, Sarpelis replied. His voice was steady, but everyone on the intercom could hear the strain beneath it. He was alone in a section of aircraft that swung in the wind like a door on a broken hinge, held in place by metal that could fail at any moment. But he didn't complain. He didn't ask to be rescued. He understood that sometimes the only contribution you could make was to not make the situation worse. The crew donned their parachutes, the familiar weight settling onto shoulders and chests. Everyone knew the drill. Count to 10 after jumping. Pull the ripcord. Hope the chute deploys. Hope you don't land in enemy territory. Hope a lot of things that were beyond your control. But no one jumped, not yet. Because Bragg and Engel were still flying the aircraft, still maintaining altitude, still pointing the nose toward Algeria and home. As long as the pilots believed they could make it, the crew would stay aboard. The miles passed beneath them. Desert, mountains, more desert. The Tunisian coastline fell behind. They crossed into Algeria, into friendly territory where a forced landing or bailout meant rescue instead of capture. But friendly territory didn't make the tail any more secure, didn't reduce the strain on the structural members holding that tail in place, didn't increase their odds beyond the marginal improvement of being over land where Allied forces operated. The bomber flew on, engines running, controls responding sluggishly, but responding. The tail swinging and flexing, but not miraculously separating entirely. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to Biskra. Every minute was another increment of probability that they might actually survive this. Navigator Nursel provided course corrections. Bombardier Burbridge watched for landmarks. The gunners scanned for fighters that never appeared, and in the tail, Sam Sarpelis stood at his guns, alone but not abandoned, separated by a 16-foot gap and 30,000 feet of altitude from any help his crew could provide, but connected by intercom and by the shared understanding that they would all make it home together, or not at all. 60 minutes after the collision, then 70, then 80. The engines continued their steady roar. Fuel consumption was higher than normal due to the increased drag from the damaged fuselage, but the tanks weren't empty yet. They would make it to Biskra before fuel became critical. If the tail held, if no other systems failed, if physics continued to grant them this temporary reprieve from consequences that should have been immediate. At 85 minutes, Biskra appeared on the horizon. The other bombers from the formation were already landing, crews descending from their aircraft to watch the sky for all American. Everyone had heard about the collision on the radio. Everyone expected to see wreckage, not a functioning aircraft. But there she was, a B-17 with her tail barely attached, flying level, maintaining altitude, approaching the airfield as if nothing was wrong except for the minor issue of catastrophic structural damage that shouldn't allow flight. Bragg fired 3 emergency flares from the cockpit. Red, the signal for wounded aboard and priority landing. The tower cleared the active runway. Crash crews positioned themselves along the approach path. Ambulances stood ready. Bragg circled at 2,000 feet, giving the other aircraft time to clear the runway, using the opportunity to test his landing gear and flaps. Would they extend? Would the additional drag from flaps cause the tail to separate? Would the landing gear handle the stress of touchdown when the tail might strike the ground without its tail wheel? The gear extended. Green lights confirmed locked position. The flaps deployed partially. Not full extension, because that might overload the damaged structure, but enough to reduce landing speed. Bragg set up for a long, final approach. 4 miles out. 3 miles, 2 miles. The bomber descended in a controlled glide, both pilots working together to maintain the precise speeds and angles that would give them the best chance of keeping all the pieces together until the wheels touched Earth. 1 mile, half a mile, quarter mile. The runway expanded in the windscreen. Approach speed holding steady. The tail was still attached. Sarpalus was still in position, his weight and presence somehow contributing to stability through mechanisms that no engineer could have predicted. The main wheels touched the packed earth of Biskra's runway. Gentle contact, professional. Bragg eased back power, letting the bomber settle onto its mains, knowing that the tail wheel was gone and that when the tail settled it would drag along the ground. The tail dropped. Metal scraped earth with a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. The bomber slowed, tail dragging, but the structure held. No final catastrophic failure, no collapse, just the grinding protest of aluminum against dirt until forward momentum bled away and all American came to rest, stationary, intact, impossible. Bragg cut the engines. The sudden silence was profound. 4 Wright cyclones that had run continuously for nearly 3 hours now sat quiet. In that silence, the crew sat motionless, processing survival, understanding that they had just experienced something that would define the rest of their lives. The ambulance approached. Bragg waved it off. No injuries, we're all intact. The crew exited through the forward hatch, climbing down to solid ground, legs shaking from adrenaline and relief. Engineers and mechanics swarmed the aircraft, staring at damage that shouldn't have allowed flight, trying to comprehend how this collection of bent metal and severed systems had remained airborne for 90 minutes. Sam Sarpalus emerged last, climbing down a ladder from his isolated tail section, stepping onto the desert sand with the careful movements of someone who had spent 90 minutes in a swinging cage 30,000 feet above ground. When his boots touched earth and the accumulated stress hit him all at once, his legs gave out. Crew members caught him, helped him to sit, stayed with him until the shaking stopped. Behind them, all Americans sat on the Biskra runway, looking like she'd been hit by a train. The tail section, no longer supported by airspeed and aerodynamic forces, sagged visibly. Engineers examined the structural connection and found that only 2 small sections of the airframe and 1 narrow strip of skin were holding the tail to the fuselage. That, plus a single surviving elevator control cable that had somehow remained intact through the collision, allowing the pilots to maintain pitch control. It shouldn't have worked. Every principle of structural mechanics said the tail should have separated immediately upon impact. But somehow, through a combination of Boeing's over-engineered design, the specific angle of the collision, and sheer improbable luck, enough structure had remained to keep everything attached. The famous photograph was taken by Lieutenant Charles Cutforth, navigator aboard another B-17 called Flying Flitgun. Cutforth had watched the collision from his aircraft and grabbed his camera to document what he was seeing. The image shows all American in flight over the Algerian desert, tail section visibly misaligned, the gash in the fuselage apparent even from a distance. That photograph would travel around the world. It would appear in newspapers, in propaganda materials, in training documents. It would become one of the most iconic images of World War II. Visual proof that American bombers could sustain damage that would destroy any other aircraft and still bring their crews home. But the photograph couldn't capture what mattered most, couldn't show the steady hands of 2 pilots fighting impossible forces, couldn't show the gunner standing isolated in a swinging tail, firing at enemy fighters while knowing that any second could be his last, couldn't show the crew that refused to abandon their aircraft or each other even when survival seemed improbable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The days following the landing brought a flood of attention that the crew of All American neither sought nor particularly wanted. Photographers arrived from Allied headquarters, journalists requested interviews, intelligence officers wanted detailed reports about the collision, about the damage, about how the aircraft had remained controllable. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened, as if understanding could somehow make it repeatable, as if All American's survival was a technique that could be taught rather than an accident of physics that shouldn't have occurred. Kendrick Bragg gave his reports with the flat precision of someone who understood that emotion had no place in official documentation. He described the collision in terms of airspeed and altitude and heading. He detailed the control difficulties, the yaw forces, the elevator response. He listed the damaged systems and the functioning systems and the improvised procedures they had used to maintain flight. What he didn't describe, because the official forms had no space for it, was the weight of knowing that 9 lives depended on decisions he made in fractions of seconds. The sound of Sam Sarpolis's voice over the intercom, steady despite being trapped in a structure that swung like a pendulum over empty air. The moment when he realized they might actually make it home. And the even stranger moment when the wheels touched ground and survival transformed from possibility to reality. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier, was more direct in his later recollections. "We were lucky," he said in interviews decades after the war. Lucky that the collision happened where it did, not 2 feet forward or back. Lucky that one elevator cable survived when all the others were cut. Lucky that the tail didn't twist off during the turn back to base. We were professionals doing our jobs, but we were also just incredibly, impossibly lucky. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The official accident investigation began within hours of landing. Boeing engineers were summoned to examine the wreckage, to understand how their design had survived forces it was never intended to withstand. What they found challenged assumptions about aircraft structural integrity. The B-17F was designed with redundancy in its airframe. Multiple stringers and formers ran the length of the fuselage, distributing loads across many structural members, rather than relying on a few critical components. When the Messerschmitt's wing had sliced through the fuselage, it had severed most of these members, but not quite all. The remaining structure, though damaged and bent far beyond its design limits, had somehow maintained enough integrity to hold the tail in position, but structure alone didn't explain continued flight. The elevator control cable that survived was equally crucial. Without elevator control, Bragg and Engel couldn't have maintained level flight. The aircraft would have either nosed down into a terminal dive or pitched up into a stall. That single cable, running through the damaged section of fuselage, had remained intact through pure chance. Had the collision occurred 6 inches higher or lower, that cable would have been severed along with all the others. The investigation also revealed something the crew hadn't known during their flight. The Norden bombsight's autopilot system had contributed to their survival. The bombsight used electrical servos connected to the rudder and elevator, and these electrical connections had survived when the mechanical control cables were cut. For portions of the flight, particularly during turns, the autopilot had supplemented the pilot's manual control inputs, providing additional pitch and yaw authority through systems that operated independently of the damaged cables. Bragg hadn't known this during the flight. He had been fighting the controls, feeling the sluggish response, compensating as best he could with the limited authority available. The autopilot had been helping him without his knowledge, its electrical signals reaching servos that still functioned, providing the margin of control that kept All American flying. Boeing incorporated lessons from All American into later B-17 variants. Additional structural reinforcement in the aft fuselage, redundant control cable routing, improved damage tolerance specifications. The engineers studied failure modes they had never considered, scenarios where partial structural failure didn't result in catastrophic loss of control, but no amount of engineering could guarantee survival of the type of damage All American had sustained. the aircraft had operated at the extreme edge of what was physically possible. Replicating those conditions deliberately would result in structural failure 99 times out of 100. All-American represented the one time when everything that could go right did go right, when every marginal factor aligned in favor of survival. The German reaction to All-American survival was more complex than simple disbelief. Luftwaffe intelligence had photographic evidence of the collision and the subsequent flight. They had reports from pilots who had attacked the damaged bomber and been driven off by defensive fire. They knew what had happened. They simply couldn't reconcile it with their understanding of aircraft structural limits. Some German fighter pilots argued that the reports were exaggerated, that the damage couldn't have been as severe as claimed, because no aircraft could fly in that condition. Others pointed to the photograph as proof that American aircraft were built with structural integrity far beyond what German designers had achieved. A damaged Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf didn't limp home. It broke apart or crashed. The fact that a B-17 could sustain catastrophic damage and continue flying represented a fundamental imbalance in design philosophy. German propaganda initially tried to suppress the all-American story, recognizing that it undermined the narrative of Luftwaffe superiority. But the photograph had already spread too widely. Allied newspapers ran it with headlines celebrating American engineering and crew courage. The image became a symbol of American industrial and technological superiority, proof that even when German fighters scored direct hits, American bombers brought their crews home. The truth was more nuanced. All-American survival wasn't purely a function of superior American engineering. It was an accident of collision angle and structural failure mode, and the specific configuration of damage that happened to leave just enough structure intact. A German aircraft subjected to identical damage might have survived equally well, or might have failed more catastrophically. The variables were too numerous and too random to support broad conclusions about national engineering superiority. But in wartime, nuance is the first casualty. All-American became a propaganda asset. Her survival transformed into evidence of American invincibility, her photograph displayed in factories to boost worker morale, her story told to flight crews to reinforce confidence in their aircraft. The crew members themselves had mixed feelings about the attention. They understood they had survived something extraordinary, but they also understood how many crews hadn't survived. For every All-American that made it home, 10 other bombers crashed or exploded or simply disappeared. Celebrating one miraculous survival while thousands died felt uncomfortable, as if their survival was somehow more meaningful than the deaths of crews who had fought just as courageously but had encountered damage that couldn't be survived. Samsopoulos, the tail gunner who had spent 90 minutes isolated in the swinging tail section, rarely spoke about the experience. When pressed, he would describe the mechanical details, the way the floor had disappeared beneath his feet, the sound of rushing air and creaking metal, the view through the gap showing sky and desert, and nothing solid between him and a 30,000-foot fall. But he wouldn't describe the fear, wouldn't acknowledge the terror that must have accompanied understanding his situation. That was private. That belonged to him alone. All-American was repaired and returned to service. The damaged tail section was cut away and replaced entirely. New stringers and formers were riveted into place. Control cables were rerouted. Hydraulic and electrical systems were restored. The work took weeks. Field mechanics laboring with limited tools and parts to rebuild an aircraft that probably should have been scrapped. When the repairs were complete, All-American flew again, but she was never quite the same. The rivet work done in field conditions created drag and vibration. Her maximum speed was reduced. Her handling characteristics were described by subsequent pilots as heavy and unresponsive. The structural repairs had restored her to flyable condition, but hadn't restored her to factory specifications. She was reassigned to the 352nd Bombardment Squadron of the 301st Bombardment Group. In March 1943, designated as a hack aircraft for non-combat utility missions, she flew one combat mission to Barizzo Airfield in Sicily on May 10, 1943. But her performance issues and the psychological weight of her history made her unsuitable for regular combat operations. Instead, All-American became a transport and utility aircraft carrying troops and cargo to wherever the advancing Allied forces needed supplies. She flew from Tunisia to Sicily to Italy. As the campaign progressed northward, she was eventually assigned to the 15th Air Force Service Command at Bari, Italy, where she served in unglamorous but essential roles until March 1945. On March 6, 1945, All-American was dismantled for salvage at Lucera Airfield in Italy. The war in Europe was nearly over. Germany would surrender 2 months later. The bomber that had survived impossible damage and become a symbol of American resilience ended her service as scrap metal, her aluminum recycled for purposes that had nothing to do with the moment of fame that had defined her existence. But the story outlived the aircraft. The photograph remained. The crew members carried their memories. And over the decades that followed, All-American's 90-minute flight on February 1, 1943, became something larger than the sum of its factual components. Like many wartime stories, All-American's tale accumulated embellishments over the years. Some accounts claimed the crew used parachute cords to tie the tail section in place, physically holding the structure together through improvised rigging. This was false. The crew wore their parachutes in preparation for possible bailout, but no one attempted to tie anything together, because accessing the damaged area was impossible and such efforts would have been futile. Other versions claimed the bomber flew all the way back to England, crossing the Mediterranean and traversing hundreds of miles of additional distance. This was also false. Biskra was 300 miles from Tunis, a substantial distance, but nowhere near the 1,400 miles that would have been required to reach England from Tunisia. The photograph that seemed to show clouds beneath the aircraft was actually showing the hazy Algerian desert, not the English Channel. Some accounts embellished the combat action during the return flight, describing prolonged dogfights with German fighters, heroic defensive actions, nearly depleted ammunition stores. The reality was simpler and less dramatic. 2 Messerschmitts made a single attack pass, were driven off by defensive fire, and didn't return. The crew's courage wasn't diminished by this more modest reality. But the truth was less cinematic than the embellished versions. The most persistent myth involved the song "Comin' In on a Wing and a Prayer," written by Harold Adamson and Jimmy McHugh, and released in 1943. Many accounts claimed the song was written about All-American, inspired by her miraculous flight. This was incorrect. The song was actually about another 97th Bomb Group, B-17, called Thunderbird, which had been given up for lost on a January 12, 1943 mission to Tripoli, but had miraculously returned to base, severely damaged. The conflation of these two stories was understandable. Both involved B-17s from the same bomb group, surviving severe damage. Both occurred within weeks of each other. Both generated significant attention, but the specifics mattered to the crews involved, to the families who wanted accurate records of what their loved ones had experienced, to the historical record that should distinguish between what happened and what was imagined. Ralph Burbridge spent decades after the war correcting these inaccuracies. In interviews and correspondence, he patiently explained the actual events, refuted the embellishments, and provided first-hand testimony about what he had witnessed. He understood that the embellished versions made for better storytelling, but he also believed that the truth was compelling enough without fabrication. Kendrick Bragg returned to civilian life after the war, graduated from Duke University with a degree in architecture, and eventually settled in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where he practiced his profession until his death in 1999 at age 81. He rarely discussed All-American publicly, though friends and colleagues knew the story. When asked about it, he would describe the technical challenges and deflect questions about heroism or extraordinary courage. "It was just flying," he would say, "just doing the job we were trained to do." But those who knew him understood that February 1st 1943 had marked him. The weight of bringing 9 men home safely from a situation where death seemed certain. The knowledge that different decisions made in those critical moments after the collision might have resulted in different outcomes. The burden of surviving when so many others hadn't. Bill Engel, the co-pilot, returned home and lived a quiet life away from aviation. He stayed in contact with other crew members, attending reunions when his health permitted, but otherwise maintaining privacy about his wartime service. In the few interviews he gave, he emphasized the crew's collective performance rather than individual contributions. "Everyone did their job," he would say. "That's why we made it home." The other crew members dispersed to civilian lives across America. Joe James, Paul Galloway, Elton Conda, Michael Zook, Harry Nuessel, Ralph Burbridge, all survived the war, all returned to families and peacetime occupations, all carried memories they sometimes shared and sometimes kept private, depending on who asked and how much understanding they thought the listener possessed. Sam Sarpelas, the tail gunner who had spent 90 minutes in the isolated tail section, died in 1988. His obituary mentioned his wartime service but didn't detail the all-American incident. To those who hadn't experienced it, the story sounded improbable, exaggerated, the kind of war tale that gets embellished with each retelling. To those who had experienced it, no description was adequate. The reality of standing alone in a structure that shouldn't be attached to anything, feeling it swing and flex in the slipstream, knowing that your weight might be the only thing preventing catastrophic failure, that couldn't be conveyed through words, that could only be understood through experience. The broader legacy of All American extended beyond the specific crew and aircraft. The story became part of the cultural narrative of World War II, one of thousands of incidents that collectively demonstrated American resilience, technological capability, and the courage of ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances. But the story also illustrated something more subtle and more important. It demonstrated the role of chance in survival. All American didn't make it home solely through superior engineering or exceptional crew skill. Those factors contributed, certainly, but the primary reason for survival was luck. The luck that the collision happened at an angle that left minimal structure intact rather than destroying everything. The luck that one critical control cable survived. The luck that German fighters didn't press their attacks. The luck that weather remained clear and no additional mechanical failures occurred during the 90-minute flight home. Acknowledging luck doesn't diminish the crew's courage or Boeing's engineering. It simply recognizes reality. War is random. Survival often depends on factors beyond anyone's control. Training, skill, equipment, quality. All of these matter and all improve odds, but they don't guarantee outcomes. Sometimes the difference between living and dying comes down to 6 inches, to the precise angle of a collision, to which cable gets severed and which one doesn't. The crews who flew combat missions in World War II understood this intuitively. They performed pre-flight checks, they maintained formation discipline, they followed procedures, they trained relentlessly, and then they climbed into their aircraft knowing that doing everything right might not be enough. That survival sometimes required luck in addition to skill. That the best crew with the best aircraft could die, while a damaged bomber with every reason to crash could limp home safely. This understanding created a particular kind of fatalism among bomber crews. Not despair, but a clear-eyed recognition that they couldn't control all the variables. They could only control their own performance and trust that probability would favor them often enough to survive their tour of duty. For the crew of All American, probability favored them dramatically on February 1st, 1943. The one time in 1,000 when catastrophic damage didn't result in catastrophic failure. The statistical outlier, the miracle, if you chose to interpret it that way, or the random fluctuation in expected outcomes, if you preferred a more mechanistic view. Either interpretation led to the same conclusion. They had survived something they shouldn't have survived, and that survival imposed obligations to honor the memory of crews who hadn't been as fortunate, to tell the story accurately so that the historical record reflected what actually happened, rather than what made for better propaganda, to live their civilian lives with awareness that they had been granted additional years that thousands of their contemporaries had been denied. The photograph of all American in flight remained one of the most recognizable images of World War II. Decades after the war, it appeared in textbooks, documentaries, museum exhibits. Each generation of viewers saw something different in that image. Some saw proof of American technological superiority. Others saw evidence of the randomness of survival. Still others saw simply a damaged aircraft that against all probability remained airborne. All of these interpretations contained truth. The photograph was a Rorschach test revealing the viewer's assumptions about war, technology, fate, and human agency. What you saw in that image of a B-17 with its tail barely attached depended on what you brought to the viewing. But for the 10 men who had been aboard that aircraft, the photograph represented something simpler and more profound. It represented the 90 minutes during which their survival was uncertain, when every second required focus and discipline, and the suppression of fear that wanted to paralyze thought and action. It represented the moment they landed and understood they would live to see tomorrow. It represented the bond forged between men who had faced death together and chosen to trust each other with their lives. That bond persisted long after the aircraft was scrapped, long after the war ended, long after some crew members died and others grew old. The survivors stayed in contact, gathering periodically to share memories and reassure each other that what they remembered was real, that the impossible flight had actually occurred, that they hadn't imagined or embellished their own history. By the 21st century, all the crew members had died. The last survivor, Ralph Burbridge, passed away in February 2013 at age 92. With his death, the first-hand testimony about All American's flight ended. What remained was the photograph, the official reports, the recorded interviews, and the story as it had been passed down through families and histories, and the collective memory of a generation that understood what strategic bombing had cost. The mathematics of strategic bombing in World War II were brutal. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 47,000 casualties, including more than 26,000 killed in action. The bomber groups that operated from North Africa and Italy added thousands more to those totals. These men flew missions knowing the statistics, understanding that their odds of completing a tour were marginal at best. In that context, All American's survival was both remarkable and representative. Remarkable because the specific damage she sustained should have resulted in immediate structural failure. Representative because surviving against probability was something bomber crews experienced routinely, albeit usually in less dramatic fashion. Every aircraft that returned from a mission had survived situations where different variables might have produced different outcomes. Every crew that completed their tour had dodged bullets, flak, fighters, mechanical failures, weather, navigation errors, and simple bad luck. All American's story was their story, compressed into 90 minutes of obvious drama, but fundamentally similar to the experience of thousands of crews who survived dozens of missions through skill, training, and the random favor of probability. The B-17 Flying Fortress itself became a symbol of American air power in World War II. Despite the fact that more B-24 Liberators were produced and saw service, the B-17's distinctive profile, its relative ease of handling compared to the B-24, and its reputation for surviving battle damage created a mythology around the aircraft that persisted long after the war ended. Boeing built 12,730 Flying Fortresses during the war. Most were scrapped immediately after VE Day. Their usefulness ended with the cessation of hostilities. A few survived in museums or private collections. Today, fewer than a dozen B-17s remain airworthy, maintained at enormous expense by organizations dedicated to preserving flying history. When these surviving fortresses fly at air shows, when their 4 Wright Cyclone engines roar to life and propel 70,000 pounds of aluminum into the sky, spectators see more than an old aircraft. They see a connection to a generation that faced existential threat and responded with industrial mobilization, individual courage, and acceptance of casualties that modern societies would find intolerable. All American no longer exists, except as photographs and documents and memories preserved in archives. But her story endures because it captures essential truths about war and survival, and the relationship between human agency and random chance. The Germans didn't believe one B-17 could fly 300 miles without a tail because their understanding of structural mechanics said it was impossible. They were right about the mechanics. What they didn't account for was the specific configuration of damage, the redundant design features, the particular angle of the collision, the survival of critical control cables, and the skill of 2 pilots fighting forces they couldn't fully control. What looked impossible from the outside was merely improbable from the inside. The difference between impossible and improbable is sometimes measured in inches, in the thickness of an aluminum skin panel, in the routing of a single control cable. Kendrick Bragg and Bill Engel didn't prove that damaged B-17s could fly without tails. They proved that under very specific circumstances, with very specific types of damage, with very specific crew responses, survival was possible where it shouldn't have been. That's a different claim, with different implications. The lesson wasn't that American bombers were invincible. The lesson was that giving up was premature until all possibilities were exhausted. That situations which appeared hopeless might contain marginal paths to survival. That training and skill created options even in circumstances that seemed to offer none. This lesson was absorbed by bomber crews throughout the Allied air forces. Don't assume. Structural damage means certain death. Don't abandon the aircraft while it still responds to controls. Don't give up on your crew members while any chance of bringing them home exists. Fight the aircraft until fighting becomes physically impossible, and even then consider whether something else might be attempted. All Americans' 90-minute flight on February 1st, 1943, became a template for possibility, not a guarantee, not a predictable outcome, but a demonstrated proof that survival could occur in circumstances that appeared fatal. And sometimes in war, knowing that survival is possible makes the difference between giving up and pressing on, between accepting death and fighting for life, between becoming a statistic and becoming a story. 10 men climbed into All-American that morning. 10 men landed safely 90 minutes after a collision that should have killed them all. The photograph shows a damaged bomber in flight, but the real image, the one that mattered to the crew and their families and the thousands of airmen who heard the story, showed something simpler and more powerful. It showed that sometimes when everything goes wrong, when the aircraft is broken and the odds are impossible and death seems certain, sometimes you still make it home. The Germans believed it was impossible. They were wrong. Not about the mechanics or the engineering or the structural calculations. They were wrong about the limits of what human beings could accomplish when surrender wasn't acceptable and survival was the only option that mattered. All-American flew 300 miles without a tail, landed safely, and proved that impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet. That's the story. That's the truth. And 70 years later, that's still what matters. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.